The wolf pup was already dying when Clara found it. It was not quite 5 in the morning. The Montana sky outside her window had not yet decided between night and dawn, and the cold coming through the gap under the front door was sharp enough to wake her from sleep. Clara Whitfield, 31 years old, a wildlife veterinarian who worked long hours and kept almost no social life, had been lying awake anyway, listening to the wind push against the side of her small house at the edge of Bitterroot Valley. She was used to strange sounds out here. Coyotes calling across the ridge. Elk moving through the tall grass behind her fence. The occasional crack of a branch in the dark that made her sit up and wait. But this sound was different. It was not a howl or a call or anything with force behind it. It was thin. Almost nothing. A sound so small she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. She pulled on her boots without lacing them, grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter, and opened the front door. The cardboard box was sitting dead center on her porch steps, as if it had been placed there by someone who took their time. It was an ordinary moving box, the kind people used when they packed up their lives and drove somewhere new. The flaps were folded shut but not taped. And from inside it came that sound again. Weak. Barely there. But alive. Clara set the flashlight on the railing and opened the box. The pup was curled in the corner of it, lying on a man's flannel shirt that had been folded into a rough square. Gray fur, silver at the tips. Eyes not yet fully open. She reached in and touched it, and felt the fever at once through her fingertips. The tiny body was burning up. Its breathing was fast and shallow, the kind of breathing that tells anyone with medical training that the clock is already moving. She did not stand there wondering where it came from. She picked it up, wrapped it against her chest inside her jacket, and went straight to the back room she used as a treatment space. Within 4 minutes she had a heating pad going, a syringe ready, and enough presence of mind to check the pup's gums, pulse, and temperature in the correct order. The temperature reading made her stomach drop. It was bad. Not fatal yet, but close to the edge of a line that was easy to cross and impossible to come back from. She walked without stopping for the next 2 hours. By 6:30, the sun had come up behind the ridge and the pup's breathing had slowed to something calmer. Not safe. Not out of trouble. But no longer racing toward the worst. Clara sat on the floor of the treatment room with her back against the wall, holding the pup against her chest under a clean towel, and let herself exhale for the first time since she had opened that box. She had worked with wolves before. Her job with the Bitterroot Valley Wildlife Collaborative took her into the field regularly, where she assisted with health monitoring, satellite collar checks, and the occasional rescue of injured animals. She knew what it meant to handle wild animals with care, to keep the right distance between yourself and the creature so that it did not grow dependent on human contact in ways that would hurt it later. She knew the rules. She had helped write some of them for the local volunteer manual. And yet she sat there on the floor of her own home, holding a wolf pup against her body for warmth, and she did not put it down. Her name was Clara Whitfield and she had lived alone in that house for 3 years. She had moved to Bitterroot Valley after finishing her veterinary degree and a field fellowship in wolf behavior, following a quiet but deep love for the landscape and the work. She had no husband, no partner, no children. What she had was a house that was always slightly too cold in winter and always slightly too hot in summer, a truck that had 140,000 miles on it, a border collie named Owen who slept at the foot of her bed, and a career she believed in completely even on the days it exhausted her down to the bone. She had not expected a wolf pup. She had not asked for one. But the box had been placed there deliberately. That was the part she kept coming back to as the morning stretched forward and the pup stayed warm and Owen circled the treatment room door with restless curiosity. Someone had lined that box with a shirt. Someone had carried that pup to her door in the dark and set it down carefully on her steps and then left without a sound, without a note, without any explanation at all. She called her supervisor at the collaborative, a steady man named Garrett Hall, who had been working in wildlife management for 22 years and was not easily surprised by anything. He was surprised by this. He drove out within the hour and stood in her treatment room looking down at the pup with the expression of a man trying to sort out a puzzle that had too many pieces. He asked the right questions. Had she heard anything? seen anyone? Were there tire tracks on the dirt road? She answered all of them no. He crouched down and looked at the pup carefully without touching it, noting the markings, the approximate age, the condition. This is a grey wolf pup, he said, which she already knew. 4 weeks old, maybe 5. It didn't get here on its own. I know, she said. He stood up and rubbed the back of his neck. I need to report this. We'll have to figure out which pack it might belong to. There are 3 active packs in the Valley Corridor and the Ridge Territory above it. One of them might have lost a pup recently. She nodded. What do I do in the meantime? He looked at the pup, then at her. You're the vet, he said. Keep it alive. Garrett fired the report. The collaborative ran a check against recent field data from all 3 known packs in the area. No pack had been recorded losing a pup during the current den season. No collared female had shown signs of distress or pup abandonment. The satellite data showed normal pack movement, normal territory patterns. Nothing out of the ordinary except for one data point that a junior researcher flagged almost as an afterthought. A large uncollared male had been detected 3 times in the past week at the edge of a range that brought him within a mile of Clara's property. He had not been identified. His size put him at the high end of what a male grey wolf in that region would typically measure, possibly beyond it. The notation in the field log read, uncollared dominant male, likely territory expansion, no further action required. Clara read that file note 3 times. She thought about the shirt in the box. Flannel, dark blue, well worn. She had not thrown it away. She had folded it and put it on the shelf in the treatment room because she did not know what else to do with it and because throwing it away felt wrong without knowing more. It smelled of pine resin and cold air and something else she could not name. The pup survived the first week. It was a fight, especially on the 3rd and 4th nights when the fever spiked again and Clara barely slept. She set alarms for every 2 hours, checked temperature and fluid intake with the discipline of someone who knew that 2-hour gaps were where things went wrong. Owen, her border collie, stayed on his mat outside the treatment room and did not bark or act out, as if he understood that noise was not welcome right now. Clara found herself talking to the pup in a low, steady voice while she walked, not saying anything meaningful, just speaking, because she had read enough about neonatal animal care to know that vibration and warmth and sound were all part of what kept something small and fragile from giving up. By the end of the 2nd week, the pup was eating on schedule and the fever was gone entirely. Its eyes had opened fully by day 10, revealing irises the pale gold color of winter light on dry grass. It moved carefully around the padded pen Clara had built inside the treatment room, investigating each corner with a seriousness that seemed almost too large for a creature that small. It had a quality of attention that Clara noticed immediately. It did not do anything without first looking at it for a long moment. It did not make noise without reason. It watched Clara the way she watched it, steadily and without embarrassment, as if they were 2 beings equally curious about each other and neither one was in a hurry to pretend otherwise. She named him Frost, because of the silver at the tips of his fur, and because of the morning he had arrived on her steps in the cold before dawn. She told herself it was a temporary name. A placeholder until he went back to the wild where he belonged. She told herself a lot of things that month. The nights were long in Bitterroot Valley in November. After Frost's last feeding each evening, Clara would sit in the chair beside his pen with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and think about the box on the porch and the shirt inside it and the uncollared male in the field data and the fact that, in all her years of wildlife work, she had never heard of a wolf deliberately delivering a pup to a human door. She was not a person who believed in coincidence as a full explanation. She was a scientist. She believed in observation, in pattern, in following the data wherever it led even when the destination made no immediate sense. And the data, as thin as it was, kept pointing in the same direction. Something out there had decided to trust her. She did not know what to do with that yet. She only knew that Frost was alive, that his gold eyes followed her every movement across the room, and that somewhere beyond the window of her small house, in the dark of the valley and the trees above it, something very large was also watching. She turned off the light each night and listened to the wind and thought, it will make sense eventually. It has to. It did not make sense for a long time. But by the time it did, nothing in her life would ever look the same again. The second pup appeared on a Thursday in February, when the valley was buried under 2 feet of snow, and Clara had begun to believe that what happened in November was a strange, one-time thing she would eventually stop thinking about. She was wrong about that on both counts. She was wrong about thinking she had stopped thinking about it, because the truth was that not a day passed without her turning something over in her mind. The box. The shirt. The uncolored male logged in the field data at the edge of her property line. Frost, who was growing fast and whose gold eyes had developed a sharp awareness that made him feel less like an animal in her care and more like a companion with his own opinion about things. She had been in contact with the Idaho Wolf Sanctuary that her collaborative worked with, discussing a reintroduction timeline. She had been doing everything right, following every protocol, keeping her emotional investment within the boundaries that her training insisted upon. And then Thursday arrived, and with it another box on her porch steps before the sun came up. This one was smaller. A shoebox, not a moving box. And the pup inside it was younger than Frost had been, barely 3 weeks old, a female with dark fur and one white patch behind her left ear shaped like a thumbprint. She was cold but not hypothermic. Dehydrated but not critical. Frightened in the way that very young animals are frightened when they cannot smell anything familiar. She made no sound at all when Clara opened the box, which was more alarming than crying would have been. Silence in a young animal often meant it had already decided not to try. Clara got her worm in 10 minutes. Fed in 20. Responsive in an hour. She sat in the treatment room with both pups and tried to organize what she was feeling into something professional and manageable. Frost, now 3 months old and growing into the athletic grace that wolf pups develop quickly, had moved to the edge of his pen and was watching the new arrival with his head tilted at a precise angle, ears forward, nose walking. He did not growl or bristle. He simply watched, with that same steady attentiveness he applied to everything. Clara called Garrett again. This time, his voice on the phone had a quality she had not heard from him before. Not surprise. Something more like a careful awareness that a pattern might be forming. Same porch, he asked. Same porch, she said. Same kind of placement. Someone set this down on purpose. No noise. No footprints I can find because of the snow. No one saw anything. There was a pause on the line. How's the pup? She'll be okay. I think she's maybe 3 weeks. Dark coat, small, white mark behind her left ear. Another pause. Then, Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. All right. Is there any part of you that wants this to keep happening? It was a good question. It was exactly the kind of question a responsible supervisor should ask. She respected Garrett for asking it, and she took her time before she answered. I want to know why it's happening, she said finally. That's what I want. He accepted that, and they both knew it was not quite the whole answer, but it was the honest part of it. The field team ran another sweep of the data. This time, the uncolored male appeared twice more in the tracking logs, both instances within 2 days of the second pup's arrival. He was moving along the high ridge above the valley, covering distance that would have taken most wolves several days to cover in that kind of snow. The senior tracker on the team, a quiet man named Owen Bates who had been studying wolf movement in this region for 15 years and who had seen nearly everything there was to see, looked at the data printout for a long time without speaking. Then he said, simply, he's not expanding territory. He's making a route. Nobody knew what to do with that either, so they wrote it down and kept watching. Clara named the second pup Wren, for the small bird that survived winters everyone else gave up on. By March she had both pups eating solid food and chasing each other around the expanded enclosure she had built in her garage. She had taken leave from 2 of her 3 weekly field assignments to make time for their care, pulling on savings she had meant to keep for roof repairs. Owen, her border collie, had adapted to the new household arrangement with a diplomacy that Clara found genuinely impressive. He stayed on his side, let them have theirs, and communicated his boundaries with calm precision that the pups, surprisingly, respected. Spring came fast and loud to the valley that year, the snow pulling back in great retreating sheets to reveal mud and then grass and then wildflowers in colors so bright after the long gray months that they seemed almost aggressive. Clara started taking Frost and ran out to a fenced section behind the house for short periods each day, letting them experience the ground and the air and the smell of the valley that they would eventually return to. She watched them carefully during these sessions, noting how quickly the natural behavior surfaced. The hunting crouch. The use of wind direction. The way Frost would stop and go perfectly still in the middle of a run for no visible reason, nose lifted, reading something in the air that Clara could not access. He was 7 months old by April and already looked like the beginning of something that would be formidable. Not large yet, but building toward it, with the long legs and deep chest of a wolf that was going to be significant when it was fully grown. He had his mother's eyes, she supposed, whoever his mother had been. Gold, steady, taking everything in. She had begun running her own unofficial cross-reference of the data on the uncolored mail. It was not part of her job description. She did it in the evenings after the pups were settled, pulling field reports and comparing timestamps, building a picture that the collaborative had not yet drawn as a single image. What she found made the back of her neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Every time a pup had appeared on her porch, the uncolored male had been documented within a mile of her property within 48 hours. Not after. Before. He appeared in the data, and then the pup arrived. The sequence was consistent and repeating. Once could be coincidence. Twice began to be something else entirely. She printed the data, laid it out on her kitchen table, and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked out the window at the ridge above the valley, dark against the evening sky, and thought about what it meant that something out there knew where she lived. That it had found her. That it kept coming back. She was not frightened. That surprised her a little. She had expected to feel some version of alarm, but instead what she felt was something more like the feeling she used to get in school when a problem she had been struggling with for days suddenly revealed the thread she needed to pull. A kind of focused, breathless attention. The third pup arrived in June. This one came in a wooden crate, the kind used for shipping, with holes drilled along the sides and a latch on the front that had been secured and then released, as if whoever brought it had first made sure it could not come open during transport and then, just before leaving, had opened it again so the animal could get air and be found. The pup inside was a male, 6 weeks old, with a reddish-brown coat that was unusual for the grey wolves in this corridor and 2 back paws that were slightly turned inward, a minor developmental issue that would not affect his life but would have made survival in the wild without a full pack around him nearly impossible. Clara stood on her porch in the early morning holding a coffee she had not had time to drink yet, looking at that crate, and felt something shift inside her. Not gently. Definitively. The way a bone sets back into place after being out of alignment. She understood, fully, in that moment, that this was not going to stop. More importantly, she understood that she did not want it to. She picked up the crate, brought it inside, and started making a phone call to the Idaho Sanctuary to discuss what it would mean to scale up her temporary facility into something more permanent. She spoke with the director there, a woman named Caroline Voss, who had been running wolf rehabilitation for 18 years and who listened to Clara's account with the kind of silence that meant she was taking it seriously. "You're describing behavior that doesn't have a good precedent in the literature," Caroline said when Clara finished. "I know. That doesn't mean it's not happening." "I know that too," Clara said. "I need to know if what I'm doing here can be done legally and properly, or if I'm about to make a mistake I can't take back." Caroline walked her through it step by step. The permits. The welfare standards. The documentation requirements. The reintroduction protocols that would apply when the pups were old enough to return to the wild. It was a long call. Clara took notes on the back of the data printout she had made the night before, the one with the uncolored male's movements tracked against the arrival of each pup. When the call was over, she sat for a moment in her kitchen. The new pup was making small sounds from the crate on the table. Through the door to the garage enclosure she could hear Frost and Wren running, the quick percussion of their paws on the padded floor. Owen was lying in a strip of sunlight in the hallway, doing nothing in particular with great dedication. Clara Whitfield looked around at the life she had built here, the clean small house and the big work and the long quiet evenings, and then she looked at the crate on the table, and she thought, all right. If this is what is being asked of me, I will do it properly. She named the third pup Copper, for his coat, and she got to work. The paperwork took 3 months. The renovation of the garage and the rear section of the property took 2 months more. She paid for most of it herself, supplemented by a small wildlife care grant she applied for in August and was awarded in September with a note from the reviewing board that called her work an unusual but compelling case for community-based conservation support. She had a full habitat space by October, certified by both the state and the federal wildlife agencies, with proper separation zones, enrichment structures, temperature control, and a documentation system that logged every meal, every health check, every behavioral observation. She did not know that she had barely started. She did not know that before the next winter was out, 4 more pups would arrive, each one in different states of need, each one left on her property with a deliberateness that defied any explanation except the one she had begun to accept and could not yet bring herself to say out loud. She did not know that the uncolored male, the one who appeared in the data before every arrival, had been moving through this territory for years before she arrived. That he had been watching the land change. That he had watched her arrive and build her life here and do her work, and had, in his own way and in his own time, made a decision about her. She did not know any of that yet. But she was learning. She was paying attention. And every morning she woke up early and checked the porch before she did anything else, because she had learned by now that he came before dawn, and that he never made a sound, and that he always left something behind. The valley spread out below the ridge in all directions, green and gold and alive, and somewhere in the trees above it, something large and sure-footed moved through the dark with a purpose that no field data had yet found the right words to describe. By the time the 7th pup arrived, Clara had not slept a full night in 11 months. She did not say this to anyone, because there was no one nearby to say it to, and because the kind of exhaustion she was carrying by then was not the kind you complained about. It was the kind that had become simply part of the structure of her life, woven into every morning and every evening like the cold coming through the window frames and the sound of the pups in the back building and Owen's steady breathing at the foot of her bed. You stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing gravity. It was always there. You moved around inside it and you kept going. The 7th pup was a female. She arrived in late January, during a stretch of weather so cold that the temperature had not risen above 0 for 9 straight days and the ground was solid iron beneath half a foot of new snow. Clara had developed a habit by then of leaving a light on above the porch through the night, a single amber bulb that she had installed in November after she realized she was losing sleep not from the pups but from the anxiety of wondering whether something was being left in the dark and she was not hearing it. The light stayed on from dusk to dawn. It cost almost nothing. It gave her something close to peace. She heard the sound at 4:17 in the morning. Not the box this time. A sound she did not immediately recognize, soft and irregular, like paper folding. She was out the door in under a minute, and what she found was not a container at all. The pup was lying directly on the top porch step, wrapped in a length of burlap that had been folded around her in a way that kept her from rolling. She was alive, conscious, and looking up at Clara with eyes the color of dark amber that held an expression that Clara could only describe, later in her notes, as knowing. Not frightened. Not confused. As if she had been expected to arrive here and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. Clara named her River, for no reason she could articulate except that the name arrived in her mind fully formed the moment she picked her up. She brought River inside, started the warming protocol she now ran with the efficiency of long practice, and while she walked she let herself think about the number 7. 7 pups in 14 months. All of them left deliberately, all of them in need, all of them arriving with the timing that the uncolored male's movements in the data consistently predicted. She had shared her cross-referencing work with Garrett, who had shared it with the broader collaborative team, and the response had been cautious but increasingly engaged. A wildlife behavior researcher from the University of Montana named Paul Hendry had contacted her in December after reading her compiled observations. He was careful and measured in the way that good researchers are, and his first email to her began with the sentence, "I am not prepared to make claims I cannot support, but I would very much like to look at your data." She had sent him everything she had. He had called her 2 days later, and the conversation had lasted 3 hours. Paul Henry was 53, gray-bearded, and had spent the last 2 decades studying wolf cognition and social behavior in various parts of North America and Europe. He was not a person who used words like remarkable unless he meant them. He used the word 4 times during that first call. He asked careful questions and listened to all of her answers without interrupting, which she appreciated, because she was not a person who spoke imprecisely and she disliked being cut off mid-thought. By the end of the call they had agreed that he would come to Bitterroot Valley in the spring to conduct a proper observational study, if she was willing to have him. She was willing. But the spring felt very far away in January, with 7 pups to care for and a facility that was running at full capacity and a cold that came through the walls no matter how much she stacked up against it. The pups were not her children. She knew this. She was deliberate about knowing it. They were wild animals in her care, temporary residents of a space she had built for exactly this purpose, on their way back to the place they belonged. Every decision she made about their care was filtered through that lens. She did not let them form bonds with her that would compromise their return to the wild. She controlled her contact with them carefully, especially as they grew. She brought in a second handler in the fall, a quiet young man named Sam Foley who was finishing his wildlife management degree and who had the right combination of patience and restraint for this kind of work. Sam came 4 days a week and never spoke unnecessarily and moved through the space with a stillness the pups respected immediately. She had protocols. She followed them. And yet, she would be lying if she said that caring for 7 lives every day for over a year had left her exactly as she was before. It had not. Something in her had grown quieter and more certain at the same time, the way a person grows who has been given a large responsibility and has not failed it. She thought differently now. She listened differently. She noticed things she would have missed before, in the field, in conversation, in the particular quality of stillness that preceded something important. Frost was 13 months old in January and nearing the point where the reintroduction conversations were becoming urgent. He was large, healthy, behaviorally sound, and increasingly drawn to the fence line, spending long periods of time facing outward toward the valley below, reading the wind. Clara watched him during these moments from a careful distance and felt something that she would not call grief, exactly. Not quite. More like the particular feeling of knowing that a thing you have poured yourself into is approaching the moment when it no longer needs you, and understanding that this is the success, not the loss. She had a meeting with the reintroduction team in February. The plan was to release Frost and Ren together in a soft release corridor in the northern part of the valley, where their age and development made integration into an established pack possible. There was a 3-year-old female-led pack in that corridor with a stable structure and an opening in its social hierarchy that the team believed Frost, given his size and temperament, could move into successfully. Clara agreed to the plan and signed the paperwork and drove home and sat in her truck in the driveway for 15 minutes before going inside. She went inside. She fed River and the others, checked on the younger pups, reviewed the next morning's health schedule with Sam over the phone, wrote up her evening notes, and went to bed. She lay awake for a while, which was not unusual. Through the window she could see the ridge against the night sky, and she thought about what Paul Henry had said near the end of their long December call, almost as an aside, in the tone people use when they are saying something they are not ready to defend formally. He had said, "You know, there are recorded cases of corvids, elephants, and certain primates deliberately bringing sick or injured group members to humans they have observed providing care. The behavior has been documented in enough cases that it's no longer considered extraordinary for those species. What's extraordinary about your situation is the species. Wolves don't do this. At least, that's what we've said up until now." She had asked him what he thought was actually happening. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you might be dealing with an animal that has figured something out. And I think he's been watching you long enough to be confident about it." She thought about that a lot in the nights. In March, 2 more pups arrived within the same week. The 8th came on a Monday, a male with a badly healed fracture in one foreleg that required immediate surgical attention and a follow-up care plan that added a new layer of complexity to the already full schedule. Clara called in a favor from a veterinary orthopedic specialist in Missoula named Helen Drake, who drove out the same day, examined the pup, and performed the corrective procedure in Clara's treatment room with the efficient calm of someone who had done harder things in worse conditions. Helen stayed for dinner afterward, looked around the facility with an expression of quiet astonishment, and said simply, "You have built something real here." Clara appreciated that more than she said. The 9th pup came on Friday of the same week, another female, healthy but underweight, with a wound along her flank that was already healing but needed monitoring. She was the most self-possessed of all the pups Clara had received, moving into the facility with a directness that made Sam laugh out loud the first time he saw it, because the pup walked straight to the center of the space, sat down, and looked around as if conducting an inspection. "She acts like she owns it," Sam said. "She might," Clara said, and she was only partly joking. Spring arrived, and with it Paul Henry, who turned out to be exactly as he seemed in his emails, careful, observant, unhurried, and genuinely fascinated by what he found. He set up a remote monitoring system on the property with trail cameras and audio sensors positioned across the perimeter, designed to capture any large animal movement in a quarter-mile radius. He was methodical about it, taking 3 days to place the equipment properly, walking the ground with a surveyor's precision, adjusting each camera angle with the seriousness of someone who knew that the quality of what he might capture depended entirely on the quality of the setup. On the 4th day, at 6:12 in the morning, while the valley was still grey with early light and Clara was inside doing the morning feeding rounds, the sensors caught something. Paul was at his monitoring station, a folding table set up in Clara's spare room with 4 laptop screens arranged across it. He stared at what the cameras were showing him for a full 30 seconds before he picked up the radio and called Clara with a steadiness in his voice that she recognized as the kind of calm a person puts on when they are trying not to convey the size of what they are feeling. "Clara," he said. "You need to come look at this." She came. She looked. The trail camera on the eastern fence line had captured an image at 6:10 and again at 6:11 and again at 6:12, 3 frames 2 minutes apart, and in each one, at the edge of the tree line 40 yards from her property, stood the largest grey wolf she had ever seen in any field or any image or any research document in her entire career. He was not moving. He was not hiding. He was standing in the open, in the early morning light, facing the house. His head was level. His posture was not aggressive, not curious in the loose way of an animal that has simply wandered into a new space. It was deliberate. It was the posture of something that has arrived at a specific location for a specific purpose and is confirming that the location is as expected. He stood there for 2 minutes and 12 seconds. Then he turned and walked back into the trees without haste, without alarm, without any sign that the cameras or the sensors or the humans inside the house had disturbed his composure in any way. Clara looked at the 3 images for a long time. Paul said nothing for a while, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. Then he said, "That is a very large animal." "Yes," she said. "He knew we were here." "Yes," she said again. "And he came anyway." She did not answer that one. She did not need to. They both understood what they were looking at. They were looking at an animal that had made a calculation and had not changed it based on their presence. That kind of certainty, in any creature, is not nothing. In a wolf of that size, documented moving through this corridor for years, appearing in the data with a consistency that now had an 11-month trail behind it, appearing on camera in the full light of morning without concealment and without fear, it was something that neither of them had a clean word for yet. Clara printed the images and added them to the file she had been building since November of the previous year, the one she had started calling in her own mind, privately, the record. She did not know yet what the record was for. She knew only that it needed to be kept, that it was evidence of something that deserved to be documented carefully, and that she was the right person to be doing it because she was the one he had chosen. Whatever that meant. However you said it in scientific language that held up under scrutiny. She was the one he had chosen. She put the images in the file and went back to work. The morning Clara came face to face with him was not the morning she expected. She had been expecting it for months, though she would not have framed it that way to anyone. Paul Henry's camera network had captured him 6 more times since the first image in the spring, always at the tree line, always in the early hours, always departing before full light. The images were remarkable in their consistency. Same posture each time. Head level. body still, facing the house, never moving toward the property, never retreating in a hurry. Just present, for a measured amount of time, and then gone. Paul had written a preliminary observational paper from the data, co-authored with Clara, that he had submitted to a wildlife behavior journal in July. The peer review process was going slowly, as it always did, but the initial reader responses had been what Paul described as unusually engaged, which in academic language meant that people were paying close attention and not sure what to do with what they were reading. Clara had been managing the facility through what she later called the full summer, which was not a formal term but was the phrase she used privately for the months between May and September, when 7 of the 9 pups were in various stages of active preparation for reintroduction. The schedule was relentless. Sam Foley had brought on a volunteer, a retired biology teacher named Donna Marsh, who turned out to have more practical animal handling ability than most people Clara had worked with professionally, and the 3 of them ran the facility with a discipline that Clara was proud of, even in the weeks when she was running on very little sleep and a great deal of strong coffee. Frost and Wren had been released in April, into the northern corridor as planned. Clara had been present at the release site, which was the protocol, and she had watched Frost walk to the edge of the open space and stop and lift his head and take in the full, unfiltered air of the valley for the first time since she had found him in a box on a November morning. He had stood there for a long moment, and then he had walked forward into the trees without looking back, and Clara had driven home and sat in her truck in the driveway for a longer time than the time in February, but she had gone inside, and she had been fine. She was always fine. That was not the same thing as always being okay, but it was what she had. The morning she came face to face with the Alpha came at the end of October, when the valley had gone gold and cold and the light had a quality that made everything look like it was already a memory of itself. She had gone out at dusk, not dawn, to check the eastern fence, because one of the younger pups had been pressing against the lower corner of it during the afternoon sessions and she wanted to assess whether the support wire needed reinforcing before dark. She had her flashlight and her field jacket and her radio clipped to her hip. She was not thinking about anything except the fence. She found the section that needed attention and crouched down to look at it, and when she stood up and turned around, he was there. 40 feet. That was the distance between them. 40 feet of open ground in the last orange light of the day, and he was standing at the edge of the grass where the tree line began, and he was looking directly at her. She did not move. He did not move. She had seen the images. She had looked at those 3 photographs from the spring cameras enough times that she could have drawn his outline from memory. But images are not the same as presence, and presence at 40 feet, in fading light, with no barrier between you and a wolf of that size, is an experience that rearranges something in the body in a way that no preparation fully accounts for. He was enormous. Not just large for a wolf. Something beyond the scale she associated with any wolf she had worked with, any wolf she had seen in the field or in photographs. He was the color of winter cloud, silver gray with darker markings along his back and shoulders, and his eyes were catching the last of the light in a way that made them glow with a steadiness that was almost uncomfortable to hold. He was not aggressive. There was no raised fur, no lowered head, no posture associated with threat. He was simply standing there, looking at her, with the same composed attention she had seen in those trail camera images. The same certainty. The same quality of having arrived at exactly the place he intended to be and being entirely at ease about it. Clara kept her breathing slow. She held his gaze, because she had spent enough time around wolves to know that looking away was not always the right choice, and with this animal, in this moment, looking away felt incorrect in a way that went beyond protocol. 4 minutes passed. She counted, afterward, from what she remembered, though time had done something strange during those minutes, stretching and compressing in ways she could not account for precisely. During those 4 minutes she thought about nothing and everything simultaneously. She thought about the box on the November porch and the shirt inside it. She thought about 9 pups, about small warm bodies and golden eyes and the particular sound that wolf pups make when they are finally safe and eating well, a sound she had come to associate with something succeeding. She thought about Paul's paper and Garrett's careful professional support and Helen Drake driving from Missoula on the same day she called and Sam Foley's steadiness and Donna Marsh's unexpected gift with frightened animals. She thought about Frost walking into the trees in April and not looking back. She thought about the data printout on her kitchen table from 14 months ago with the uncolored males' movements mapped against their arrivals, the pattern so clear once you saw it that you could not understand how you had missed it. She thought about how alone she had been when she moved here. Not unhappy, but alone in the particular way of a person who has organized their life around work because work was sufficient and meaningful and never asked for things she did not know how to give. She had not expected anything to break that arrangement open. She had not been looking for anything to change it. And then he lowered his head slightly. Not aggressively. Not in submission. Something between the two, something she did not have a clean word for, the kind of gesture that exists in the space between species where language has not yet arrived but communication already has. He turned. He walked back into the trees. Unhurried, straight-backed, without any sound that she could hear. At the foot of the tree line, where the grass ended and the dark began, there was something she had not seen when she first turned around. A pup, curled in the dry leaves, smaller than any that had arrived before. So small that Clara's chest did something sharp when she saw it. She walked to it carefully and crouched down. It was breathing. It was warm. Its eyes were shut. It was the smallest wolf pup she had ever held, maybe 2.5 weeks old, a female with a pale grey coat and the most fragile set of bones Clara had ever felt under her hands. She worked all night to keep her alive. She did not go to sleep. She did not stop once. By the time the sky outside began to go from black to grey to the tentative blue of early morning, the pup was stable and feeding and making the small sounds that meant the danger had passed. Clara sat on the floor of the treatment room with the pup against her chest and Owen lying beside her and the familiar sounds of the other animals beginning to stir in the building out back, and she let herself feel, just for a few minutes, what she had not let herself feel during the night. Not relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. Something larger. Something she was not sure she had the right word for in any language she spoke. She named the pup Echo. She wrote in her field notes that evening, with the same careful language she used for everything, except for the last line, which she wrote without pausing to review it. She wrote, "I think he has always known exactly what he was doing. I think he understood what I was before I understood it myself." She closed the notebook and turned off the light and went to bed, and for the first time in over a year she slept through the night without waking once. The winter after Clara came face to face with him was the hardest and the most productive of her life, and those two things were connected in ways she only understood clearly when she looked back on it later. By December she was caring for 11 pups simultaneously, the largest number she had managed since the facility opened. Echo, the pup left at the tree line in October, was the most demanding of them. Her size at arrival had been so small and her early days so precarious that she required a level of monitoring that Clara maintained with a discipline that left very little room for anything else. Sam Foley had increased his days at the facility to 6 per week. Donna Marsh was coming in every morning. Clara had brought on a third volunteer in November, a steady-handed young woman named Grace Elliott who was finishing her veterinary technician certification and who moved through the facility with a precision that Clara respected immediately. The days had a rhythm by then that Clara could feel in her body even before she was fully awake each morning. She would lie in bed for a moment in the dark, running the day's schedule in her mind before she opened her eyes, and then she would get up and start. There was always something that needed doing. There was never a point at which everything was done. She had accepted this, the way you accept the weather in a place you have decided to live, not without preference but without argument. Paul Hendry's paper had cleared peer review in November and been accepted for publication in a wildlife behavior journal that both of them considered serious. The editorial note accompanying the acceptance had been longer than usual, and one of the reviewers had written a commentary to accompany the paper, which was unusual and which Paul said, in the understated way he had, suggests people think this is significant. Clara had read the reviewer's commentary 3 times and felt each time the particular mix of satisfaction and responsibility that comes when work you have done quietly and without expectation is seen by people who understand its weight. The documentary crew had reached out in January. Clara did not immediately say yes, because she was careful about anything that brought cameras near the pups and near the property in ways that might disrupt the patterns she had worked to protect. She had a long conversation with Paul about it, and a longer one with Garrett, and a short one with Caroline Voss at the Idaho Sanctuary, and all of them said the same thing in slightly different words: the work deserved to be seen, and if it was going to be seen, it was better to control how. She said yes with conditions, and the conditions were accepted, and filming began in March. The crew was 4 people, led by a documentary director named Oliver Kane who had made 3 previous films about wildlife conservation, all of which Clara had watched before agreeing to speak with him. He was direct, prepared, and had the useful quality of understanding when silence was better than a question. He and Clara reached an understanding quickly, built on the shared recognition that she was the authority on what happened here and he was the person responsible for making it comprehensible to an audience that did not share her training. The filming took 6 months and was intercut with the daily reality of the facility, which meant that the crew documented 2 more pup arrivals, 4 health crises of varying severity, 1 surgical procedure performed by Helen Drake with the cameras rolling, the successful reintroduction of 3 pups into Valley territory, and 1 morning in May when Clara walked out to check the porch at 4:40 and found, instead of a container, a set of tracks in the soft ground at the foot of the steps. Large tracks. Very large. Coming from the direction of the tree line, stopping at the base of the steps, and then turning back. No pup. Just the evidence of a visit that had been reconsidered, or that had been a different kind of visit than the ones before. The camera crew was not awake yet. Only Clara saw the tracks. She photographed them carefully and added the images to the record and stood there for a moment in the pre-dawn quiet, thinking about what it meant that he came to the steps and did not leave anything. She thought it meant he had come to check. That he had stood at the foot of her steps in the dark and confirmed that she was still here, still doing the work, still the person he had decided she was. That the visit had not been about delivery. It had been about verification. She did not say this in the documentary, because it was not the kind of thing you could say on camera without it sounding like something it was not. But she wrote it in her notebook that morning in her careful, factual language, and the fact that she wrote it meant she believed it, and believing it meant something had happened inside her that could not be undone. The documentary aired in the following spring, on a platform with international reach, and the response was larger than anyone involved had anticipated. Not viral, not a sensation, but something more durable than either of those things. It was watched steadily and carefully by a lot of people who wrote to Clara afterward with messages she took seriously because they came from a place of genuine engagement rather than spectacle. Scientists wrote. Teachers wrote. Parents of young children wrote, parents who had watched it with their kids and wanted to say thank you for making the world feel larger and more full of possibility than the news usually did. A wildlife biologist in Finland wrote to tell her that she had been working on a similar observational framework for a different species in a different context and that reading Paul's paper and watching the documentary had clarified something she had been trying to name for 2 years. Clara answered every message. She did it slowly, over many evenings, in the same careful language she used for everything. By the end of that year she had raised 19 pups. 14 had been successfully reintegrated into wild populations in the Valley Corridor and the Northern Range. 3 were permanent sanctuary residents due to injuries that made full release inadvisable. 2, Frost and Echo, occupied a category that the reintroduction team and Paul Hendry and Clara herself could not quite resolve into the standard language of either wild or tame, because neither word was accurate. Frost had been successfully placed into the Northern Park and had been tracked there for 18 months, functioning well within the social structure, and yet the satellite data showed him returning twice to a range within a mile of Clara's property in patterns that corresponded to no territory function the research team could identify. Echo, released into a Southern Corridor park in the fall, had been photographed 3 times near the property fence line in the first month after release, always in the early morning, always alone, always departing before the day fully began. The research team discussed it at length. Paul wrote about it in a follow-up paper. Nobody reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone. Clara reached her own conclusion, privately, which she wrote in her notebook but did not publish. She wrote that she believed the animals that had been raised here carried something with them that the standard categories did not have room for. Not dependency. Not domestication. Something more like memory. The kind of deep cellular memory of a place that had meant safety during the most vulnerable period of existence, a memory that did not override the wildness but existed alongside it, the way a person can carry the memory of a childhood home their whole life without being defined by it or returning to it, just knowing that it exists in the body as a coordinate. She walked the property in the evenings when the work was done and the light was leaving the valley, and she thought about the word she kept coming back to. She had not used it in any paper. She had not used it in the documentary. She had used it only in her notebook, once, in a sentence that read, "I think what he did was ask me something. I think what I did was answer." The porch light stayed on through every night. It had stayed on for years by then, through winters and springs and the slow turning of seasons over the valley, a single amber light above the steps, visible from the tree line. She was asked in an interview, the only print interview she gave that year, whether she thought the Alpha King knew what he was doing when he left the first pup on her steps. Whether she believed it was intentional, purposeful, the result of something like thought. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. Then she said, "I believe he identified something in me and made a decision based on it. Whether that is what we call thought, I cannot say with certainty. But I have been a scientist long enough to know that the absence of a vocabulary for something does not mean the thing is not happening." The interviewer wrote that down and asked if she would say more. She said, "He found the right person. I don't think that was an accident." She still lived in the same house at the edge of Bitterroot Valley. She still drove the same truck, now with 190,000 miles on it. Owen the border collie had gone grey around the muzzle but still slept at the foot of her bed and still waited outside the treatment room door with that patient, diplomatic neutrality that she had always found remarkable in him. Sam Foley had finished his degree and taken a permanent position with the collaborative but still came to the facility 2 days a week because, as he told Clara once without looking at her directly, it was the best work he had ever done. The facility ran a full calendar year now, certified and funded and staffed properly, with a waiting list from wildlife agencies in 3 states who had heard about what she had built here and wanted to know if she could take a specific animal, a specific case, a situation that did not fit the standard framework. She said yes when she could. She said not yet when she could not. She was honest about capacity and she never overpromised, and the work was done carefully every day, the same way it had been done since the first morning she opened a cardboard box on her porch in the cold before dawn and found a 4-week-old wolf pup burning with fever and barely breathing. In the spring of the 5th year, the uncolored male appeared on camera again. Paul's monitoring network was still active, refined now into a more sophisticated system with better sensors and wider coverage, and the image it captured on a morning in April was the clearest they had ever gotten. He was standing at the tree line in full morning light, and his eyes were visible in the photograph with a detail that the earlier images had not had. They were pale gold. Steady. Taking everything in. He stood there for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then he turned and walked back into the trees, and the image went still, and the valley was quiet, and the light moved across the grass in the unhurried way it always did. Clara printed the photograph and held it for a moment. She had been looking at images of this animal for 5 years. She knew his proportions, the angle of his shoulders, the way he held his head when he was observing something. She knew him the way you know something you have studied with genuine attention over a long period of time. Not completely. Not without mystery. But with a depth that was its own kind of knowing. She put the photograph in the record, which now filled 2 large binders and a hard drive and a section of the cloud server that Paul's University had set aside for the project. She closed the binder and stood at the window of her house and looked out at the ridge above the valley, the familiar dark line of trees against the sky that she had looked at every morning and every evening for 5 years. She thought about what she had been before any of this. A good veterinarian. A careful scientist. A woman who lived alone in a house that was always slightly too cold and always slightly too quiet and who had organized her life around work because work was enough. She thought about what she was now, which was all of those things still, plus something else. A person who had been found. Who had been assessed by something wild and certain and given a responsibility she had not asked for and had not refused. Who had done the work every day without exception and who had built, out of early mornings and exhaustion and precise documentation and a porch light left burning through the dark, something that was not just a facility or a research project or a conservation outcome, but an answer to a question that had been asked of her in the only language available, which was action and trust and the weight of a small body placed carefully on the right set of steps before the world woke up. She did not think the question was over. She checked the porch one more time before she went to bed, the way she did every night, because he came before dawn and he never made a sound, and the light was already on, and she was already ready, and whatever came next would be met the same way everything before it had been met. With attention. With care. With the quiet, absolute certainty of a person who has learned, through 5 years of early mornings and hard work and an extraordinary animal watching from the tree line, exactly who she is. The porch light stayed on. It always does.